curl dimensions within martial arts. Man's relationship with nature was once solely magical, as we all know. And again, to give an example that most of us know already, we literally thought that natural processes were actively targeting us, either to our aid or to our detriment, which made, of course, our relationship with nature very emotional, inherently emotional. But over time, we moved into a mythical approach, which allowed us to think of our natural environment in terms of symbols, in terms of myth. Thus, we took one step away from our emotional attachment to nature and one step towards a more practical relationship with nature, more abstractified, if you will. Which again brings us to present day, where we observe most people's relationship with nature as very abstract, very emotionally distant. But we also observe the consequences of developing this worldview, as it's endorsed an iron tie between sacrificing nature to endorsing human progress, technological progress. And we've observed the rise of counter movements to this mindset, movements which endorse the belief that we have no right to exploit this world to the extent that we do, and that we're only one piece of a vast ecosystem, rather than the tip-top of a very linear food chain. Quite obviously, there's a dissonance between these two dialogues. That's why we're here today. And frankly, it's a dissonance that divides not only us, but most industrial nations around the globe. So the question is, and has been, how do we foster a new medium of communication, a new dialogue between these opposing sides? And it's a difficult question enough without the consideration that these two opposite dialogues and mindsets have been created by the same accrual of consciousness. Two different reactions to one phenomenon, one history, one humanity. But just as Gebserian consciousness structures helped us as humans develop these two opposing mentalities, particularly in the world of policy, which is where we see it really butt heads and really grate against each other in a way that doesn't produce any meaningful result to our nature. I think it's also true, and we have to consider that Gebserian consciousness can help solve this problem under the right application. These three very different ideas that I've talked about that are often a little bit slippery, at least for an undergrad who doesn't deal with conceptual thinking as much as most of you. The ideas of man's relationship with nature, the idea of consciousness structures, the idea of martial arts as a whole, all begin to tie together when we look for parallels rather than direct, concrete connections. So, when we view martial arts through the lens of Gebserian consciousness structures, we can begin to see a potential solution to the rigid, polarized dialogue about man and nature. That is because martial arts, as we've established, is a balanced embodiment of magical, mythical, and perspectival consciousness. As a discipline, martial arts is indeed a harmony of art, practice, and study, and thusly an example of integral consciousness, the goal. And transitioning into integral consciousness could be a way, according to Gebser, to inspire a dialogue about man's relationship with nature, to mend the holes, to prevent further damage. Hopefully, that is a dialogue that would work towards more empathetic, more efficient problem solving. On a final note, I challenge you to see the discipline of martial arts as an art form, as an applicable practice, and a thought-provoking study, as it very certainly is. And with that, I would like to conclude by demonstrating for you Kiyoshi Dave Kovar's Kempo Katas with my own slight modifications and interpretations involved in that. Q&A. We'll proceed afterwards, if you're not too afraid of me afterwards. Kempo Katas.
Sure. Yeah. Let's stay here.
I'm going to sit down. That is my purview for the day. Questions, comments, snarky remarks?
I don't have any snarky remarks, but I was wondering what your thoughts are in terms of integrality, the rise of mixed martial arts, and even the kind of syncretic mixing of tradition and then new American styles, as you were discussing. I suppose I'm curious about your thoughts on that and integrality. I used to practice martial arts for quite a bit, and big fan of Bruce Lee. And Bruce Lee, of course, was always about that kind of bringing together things with efficiency, very kind of mental approach to martial arts, but also rooted in that tradition. So if you could just comment on this whole idea of mixed martial arts and sort of complementary practices.
Sure. To me, it seems that in regard to our relationship to nature, that we constantly look for things that are within our soul, if you will, because we see so many mistakes in the way that we treat nature, and we see so many regretful instances of man's relationship with nature, his abuse of nature, and also man's relationship. And to me, martial arts represents a glimmer of hope, because it is that integration of harmony between past tradition, present application. To me, it's just a very well-rounded and a very balanced way to engage the different parts of our mind that remain in those historical states of magical consciousness, mythical consciousness, and of course perspectival consciousness as well. And because it has such a emphasis on discipline and an emphasis on understanding the study, but also the history, and also there are just some things that are very magical because it's tradition, it's the way we do it. End of story, you don't question it. To me, that's a very good check on our perspectival living, as it is currently very consuming for most societies and most people. And I'm not saying that martial artists are the embodiment of that, but I do think that as a discipline, martial arts can be a very valuable tool to apply to work towards a more balanced state of mind that we see is very lacking today, for the most part. Does that answer your question?
Definitely, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bruce Lee, by the way, is a Seattleite. He's buried here in Seattle. So those are.
When we go on the walking tour with his
See you Sunday. Thank you for that. And my question is about the relationship between Shorinji Kempo and Zen, and I'd like to contextualize that. You know, Shorinji, of course, is Shaolin Temple, and that's famous not only for Kung Fu, Shorinji Kempo, but also for Bodhidharma. That was the place that rejected Bodhidharma, and then he sat in his cave right outside the temple. And in the Shaolin Temple to this day, they still say that when Bodhidharma came back down to the temple, he was one of the founders of this art because it comes deeply from Zen. And that he was the one who saw our relationship to, our interpenetration with all other life forms, and hence the arising of the animal poses. So my invitation is to speak more about the Zen side of it. In the beginning, though, the two are meant to go together.
Absolutely. I actually begin to answer your question, I hope, with a question. Are you familiar with the Matosi clan?
No.
I'm not sure if it's from the same area, because you're talking about the Shaolin temples, but we have a lot of influence from the Matosi clan, and I know that they're Japan-based as Shaolin is that correct?
Yeah, but Shorinji is a Japanese reading of the kanji character Shaolin Temple.
Okay. I'm not sure if regionally those two are connected, but I know that we take a lot of influence from the Matosi clan. I suppose I would like a little bit more context on your definition of Zen because we, I'm sure, talk about similar content to Zen, but we don't label it that way. So I want to make sure I'm going down the specific avenue that you're intending to guide me towards with language that I haven't been exposed to.
Yeah, you know, Bodhidharma is famous when he was rejected by Shaolin Temple to have sat in his cave unmoving for 9 years. And he is later said to have been the architect behind Shorinji Kempo. So there was that very ancient association.
Absolutely.
But you know, when you go to Shaolin Temple today, it's amazing because the entire city has tens of thousands of people doing the katas all over the city. I mean, it's all you do. It's like a kung fu city.
It really is like
and then you come to Bodhidharma's cave. I mean, I went there on pilgrimage. I was like the only person in the city not there for kung fu. And then you walk up the mountain, you have it all to yourself. There's like no connection any longer.
I do want to say, perhaps this is a better way to answer your question, that I think obviously Zen has a very, very spiritual element. That's not all that Zen is, to me at least, or at least in my practice of it, but it's definitely dips a lot of fingers into that honeypot, if you will. And I do think that that's something that's been lost in our transition away from magical consciousness. That was, in fact, one of the things that probably really left when we transitioned from mythical to perspectival, in my opinion, because we saw a lot of that symbolic reasoning, that mythical consciousness that relied on spiritual meaning and that relied on our emotional and our spiritual connection to certain figures, certain practices, certain traditions. And I think when we transitioned out of that sort of symbolic and out of that literal thinking, we lost that spiritual connection. And I think Zen and I think sort of a more spiritual practice of martial arts with that mentality, with that lifestyle, with that integration of everything that is yourself, whether that's, your soul, your chi, whatever it may be. I think that's a very difficult thing to get back now that we've seen whole styles really shift to a focus on perspectival thinking, if only for the profit of making their business, applicable to the masses. Not everybody would want to, you talk about discipline, you talk about, the amount of dedication and the amount of heart and soul and spirit that original martial artists put into it, sitting still for 9 years, You talk about kind of the traditional origins of martial arts, and most people aren't interested in that practice anymore. Maybe because of that spiritual aspect, intensifies the practice and intensifies your dedication to it. Most people feel uncomfortable with that. I think that's why a lot of people shy away from the concept of Zen in general. It's something that people, as you probably unfortunately know, kind of put into this category of, I don't want to touch that because it feels foreign to me, and I think that foreignness is rooted in its spirituality and in its intensity of dedication, which again, has been lost in some of the martial arts as well.
So can I just dovetail on that? The thing that struck me when I went to Zhengzhou and I went to the Shaolin Temple, there were two things that blew my mind, that made this an integral moment for me. One was the holes that the monks had put in the trees from years and years of hitting the tree at the exact same spot, at the exact same posture. And the other one was the footsteps that were like 4 inches into the stone floor, that were made from centuries of stomping on the floor at that particular place in bare feet. And to me, that was it. The idea that there's this connection. You don't need words to say that connection. You just have to look at the way that they're connected to the trees and they're connected to the stones, and and I was so blown away by that I didn't make fun of these men for walking around in Ugg boots. Also, they were Shaolin monks, and I didn't want to get killed. But I had no words for that relationship that I saw.
Please.
It's mostly just sort of a comment on something you said that I found really fascinating, super intriguing. I like that you made the connection to those poses having like an animal origin.
Sure.
It strikes me as really profound that we often forget that our consciousness is very much embodied. We are utterly embodied no matter how much we try to digital ourselves out of it. And it strikes me that connection to the magical must be particularly profound because of learning those forms that require particular use of our body mechanics. And unlike language, which we have this profound connection to, but it shifts and changes over time, our body mechanics really aren't substantially different from 100 generations ago, 200 generations ago.
I have never considered that point, that that is a unique historical tie that words and language and even ideas and concepts can't accomplish, because you're right, it changed so rapidly. So equally, thank you for that.
But is there any way for you to express your flow of consciousness when you're doing that demonstration?
Is there define
Flow. For instance, the relationship between the movements. Is it one to the other, or is it a continuous flow for the entire process? And is what goes through your mind when you're doing it?
Sure. I'm just to clarify, I'm assuming you mean how do I rather than if I do?
Yes.
Okay. Just making sure. It is very interesting, because when I first started this paper and started playing around with these concepts, it was actually doing martial arts that really, the connection between communications theory, specifically consciousness structures, and martial arts really struck me because of what was happening as I was involved in my body mechanics of the movement. I found myself comparing my mindset and what I'm experiencing mentally when I'm learning a technique, when I'm performing something new or taking in new content, versus when I'm doing a form that I've known for years, like the one that I just performed. And it's very abstract and it's very academic and technical when you're learning new content, of course, like anything else. And it's interesting, because the more you practice, the more you're able to shift back to that embodiment, to that feeling and that emotional connection that we first saw the art originate in, which, kind of on a side note, is why I think masters are able to tune in with that far more than new students to the art, because it does take that practice and it takes that time to kind of, if you will, work backwards on that timeline. So to me, what it feels like that experience is, it's just like the technical stuff fades away. And all of a sudden, you're able to shift back one step to that mythical practical application where you're thinking not about the technique that you're doing, but about where your opponent is, where your body space is in relation to them. And then you take it back one step further after that, as again, you kind of surrender yourself, if you will, to the movement, to the art form, where this is gonna sound totally corny, and I apologize, this is a little bit of a personal note, but it almost feels like colors. Colors. It's almost like how we associate a very primal and a very emotional feeling with colors. It's like that. It's, you know, it's red when it's intense. It's the most wordless and timeless feeling and connection to what your body's experiencing, and the only way that, me personally, my mind is able to attempt to visualize that, I'm a very visual learner, is sometimes it'll be through color, sometimes it'll be a feeling that sort of registers that color, if you will.
Can I interject something? So it seems as though I could see there was a snake, there was a tiger, a monkey, and what else?
Let me see.
Okay,
There was crane in the beginning, there was tiger in the middle and at the end. There was, I'm pretty sure there's a little bit of mantis in there, but I'm not nearly as familiar with the mantis poses. My style does dabble in the monkey, the crane, the tiger. And I mean, that's pretty much the extent of my style because of the styles that it draws upon.
My question is, does tiger have a color? Does monkey have a particular, for you, does tiger have a color? Does monkey have a color? Does crane have a color?
Sort of, yes.
So they have almost their unique color?
Absolutely, because those styles, like a color for me, would draw upon a specific embodiment, a specific emotion and connection and sort of origin, if you will. And it's by no means a stretch to say that those two different representations might just be two ways of expressing the same psychological.
Right, so what I'm saying is, you could say then that if you have those, that each one of those colors is then also associated with a state of consciousness for you, and a state of embodied consciousness.
Absolutely.
And if you take that into consideration, what you've just discovered is the entirety of the 5-element system through the lived experience of being in your body and practicing. And you don't need to go back and read it in a book. You've discovered it arising as a lived experience. And that's integrality.
I certainly haven't considered it.
And it's the answer to Jason's question. I, as an experimental writer, that's my field, and these are my peers, and I see my genre falling away from spirit so quickly, and in a revolt, and also in a turn towards the body. Embodiment, somatics, that's the big thing right now. How can language come out of the experience of the body in a way that's completely whole? And maybe we're not even using the words spirit and matter anymore, because those terms today in 2016 just don't answer the questions anymore. And Rebecca, maybe you see this in your field as an art historian when you're looking at work done this year, when you look at work in America or in Berlin or in South Africa, The forms, they're reaching towards a physical experience of something alive, something that wants to bring in some new purpose, some sense of, oh, this is why I'm here. Different from what I inherited. And I think when I saw you do your form, your use of breath, because you're speaking about your study of communication and martial arts, and how is martial arts communicating something? So you created a story, you created a narrative, and I was watching the way you used your breath as punctuation, but it was way more than punctuation. I was so interested in your breath, and in the quick exhales, and then you pulled it back, and then you hold it, and then you took it someplace else, and you grabbed it from someplace else. And I don't know if you're aware of that, if your use of that, but for me, that was a whole a world that you were bringing in that had such spirit, which even David, even you were saying how Gebser was afraid to even explore that word or that area, but he does sometimes, but he doesn't know how to express it in this new experience of space and time.
Mm-hmm. Is that a question?
What was that question?
So it was just to you, are you aware of your embodiment of this Zen essence that is expressed in the communicative aspect of your interpretation of these things?
As with anything else, I have only my lived experience in my brain to go by. But based on that, I would say most of the time, no, it doesn't feel like that. And maybe it's, I couldn't tell you why. There are times when I feel very connected to the art, like it is, and again, on another perhaps unnecessary personal note, it is pretty much a spiritual stand-in for me. I've never been particularly religious. Yes, my notes straight, by the way. But and so there have been times when it really, I lean on it in the way that I would a spiritual connection to formal religion. And in those times, I feel very connected to it. But the practice itself, to me, on a day-to-day, doesn't feel like I am the embodiment of Zen. It's sort of something that rests in the back of my mind. It's almost like there's a piece of me that can draw upon that Zen when it's necessary, or always knows that this practice, this methodology, or I should say this practice, this physical form of expression is sort of my tool to reach into the back of my brain and step into that Zen space when I don't have another place to go that's Zen, if that makes sense. So I definitely rely on martial arts and its physical practice as sort of a way for my brain to be like, I'm stressed or I'm lost or I'm feeling overwhelmed by the weight of the world's problems, as I often do, unfortunately, as we all do, I'm sure. And when you sort of flounder and think, where do I go? Where's my safe space? I go back to that Zen place in the back of my mind that I can't reach normally without that bridge of the physical practice of martial arts. It's something I have a very hard time getting into just by mentally telling myself, it's there, it's okay. It's like I have to physically be practicing the art in order to connect with that space. Does that answer your question?
Just one quick question, then we have to go to the other side of the room.
I once had the blessing of, back where I'm from in Albuquerque, Mexico, leaving an Indian restaurant. And I don't know how, but I was welcomed by this praying mantis. And had a dialogue with this praying mantis. My wife and I both did. And then we discovered that this praying mantis was right in front of this mantis martial arts school. Curious if you could speak to the Mantis, because you kind of alluded to that those were imposters or something that had some complexity that you were now working with or something. So what is it about the Mantis? What's going on there?
In our specific style, we have just in the bigger scheme of things, we integrate animal forms relatively little compared to a lot of Eastern styles that really draw everything, all of their essence from one or many of those forms, but sometimes it's only one form that a whole style, a whole practice is based on. And yes, that's an example of the school that you saw. So I'm unfortunately not a wealth of information on the Mantis specifically, but from what I understand, it's a figure and a representation and supposed to be an embodiment of wisdom and agility is what I think of when I hear the Mantis. And we practice the agility part of it quite a bit because you see a lot of the other flows like crane and monkey being flexible and movement oriented and very soft and what is Eastern style for the most part. We think of it as very, for lack of a more academic term, flowy and flexible in that way. Sorry, I couldn't come up with better words. But yes, the Mantis is about wisdom, it's about agility, and similar, I think, to the dragon, who I haven't mentioned. I think of the Mantis, the dragon, the tiger, a lot about physical energy in a way that some of the softer styles or animals aren't necessarily. So energy, I think, plays a lot into it as well. If that answers your question.
Sure.